What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another Guild Wars 2 Noob Guide video. In this video, we're going to talk about some other aspect of making your build, and we're almost finished actually with the build part of this series. But this series is going to be about boons and conditions. So in the last video we covered gears and stats, and the one before that we did skills and traits. Now we just have one aspect left to cover, and that is boons and conditions. So right away I want to say, if you like these videos, if you want to see more, and if you also want to catch my live streams, then please feel free to leave a like and subscribe. It's down there, the red button is down there. Anyways, so let's get into it. Basically, there are two different types of different like condition type things. I don't want to say conditions because it's actually a term, but two different types of status effects that you can have in this game, aside from like unique ones, such as, for example, the Banner of Discipline. That's a unique buff. However, aside from that, there are buffs and debuffs that characters can apply that well, they're basically buffs or debuffs, and any character can have access to many of these things. There are a few that some classes do not have access to, and we will get into those as we go along. But first of all, we're going to talk about the conditions. Okay, conditions are a bad thing when you have them on you, and a good thing when you have them on an enemy. And some of them deal damage, okay? Some of them are like damage over time, but some of them have more of a control effect. And we're going to talk about each one. And I mentioned back in the gear and stats video that condition damage, and we will show you condition damage right here. Condition damage is a little bit difficult to predict exactly how it's going to affect you because it scales differently with different conditions. And we're going to actually talk about that. So first, we're going to talk about the actual conditions that deal damage. All right, and in order to do that, I'm going to show you kind of these skills that inflict these certain conditions. So first of all, we've got bleeding. Okay, bleeding is a very basic damage thing. It stacks intensity. Okay, and some conditions do not stack intensity, they stack duration, meaning that if you get a stack of a certain condition, let's say blindness, for 5 seconds, and then you get another stack of blindness for 5 more seconds, it's not going to have 2 stacks for 5 seconds, it's just going to have 1 stack for 10 seconds, okay, if that makes sense. However, with bleeding, if it stacks intensity, that means if you get 2 stacks applied for 5 seconds, then you actually will have double the effect of 1 stack for 5 seconds. It's not going to be this thing for 10 seconds, okay? So, the first one is bleeding, and it stacks, I think I remember it stacks about 6% of your condition damage, or scales, I should say. It scales 6% of your condition damage is going to be carried over into the extra damage of bleeding. So, that's something to keep in mind. Next we have burning, okay, and burning is something that actually is more damaging, okay, but it's more difficult to apply burning for a long period of time, and it's more difficult to apply more stacks of burning. But if you can apply a lot of stacks of burning, then it ends up being very, very good. See, bleeding scales 6% of your condition damage, gets added to the damage of burning. And by the way, this also scales with your level. Okay, all these damage dealing conditions also do scale with your level. Some scale a little bit more, some scale a little bit less. Burning scales 15.5% of your condition damage. I always get the hiccups when I do these videos, and I have no water. So burning is definitely a more damaging skill. You can see this burning for 2 seconds is going to give you, it's going to do 30 damage, whereas bleeding, 1 stack of bleeding for 8 seconds is going to do 26 damage. And you can see this is really downscaled. These are downscaled values because my effective level is 5. So keep that in mind because it does scale with your level. But even with that in mind, you can see that burning does a crap ton more damage than burning. Or sorry, burning does more damage than bleeding. Okay. Next is confusion. Okay, and confusion is a condition. Warriors don't have a lot of access to confusion, but we do have some, and that is in the trait Merciless Hammer. And In PvE, it will do a little bit of damage based on your condition damage, a little bit of damage over time, but oh no, it doesn't. It does not actually scale with your condition damage. It always does a flat amount over time in PvE. In PvP, it does not do damage over time. The main feature of Confusion is the fact that it does damage every time a skill is used. So in the case of Confusion, it actually scales like 9.75% of your condition damage, and that is the damage on skill use. So if you have 100 condition damage, then the Confusion is going to do an extra 10 damage per skill use. Okay, and the idea is that you want to punish something. You want to punish the enemy using skills every time, so they have either two choices: either they can do nothing and take no damage, and then just let you attack them, or they can actually do something about it and they're taking a lot of damage. Okay, so that's the idea of Confusion. But they did actually modify Confusion, where if you actually use a skill that will cleanse the conditions, such as Natural Healing will remove boons and conditions, if you use something that's going to cleanse Confusion, then it doesn't actually apply the damage. And that's a really good change, because you had cases where mesmers in the form of mirages were able to stack like 40 stacks of Confusion on you, and then you would use one skill to cleanse it, and it would do so much damage it would just kill you anyway. So you either just wait for it to do the damage over time, or you can cleanse it and die anyway. They changed that to where it no longer does damage over time in PvP, and also if you cleanse it or if you convert it, because some classes have skills that can convert conditions into boons, and in which case you're converting. I don't know what Confusion actually converts into. I don't know, but anyway. So that's the idea of Confusion. Next is Torment, and Torment. Yeah, okay, I'll go over Torment. I meant to say Poison, but Torment anyway is similar. Torment is another thing that does damage over time, and it scales with your condition damage, and I believe it scales the same way as Bleeding. I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that the main thing about Torment is that it does double damage. I think it's double damage if your target is moving. Okay, if they're staying still, it doesn't do very much damage, but if they are moving, then it does a lot more damage. And basically, Bleeding is like the midpoint. Okay, so if you just think about the bleeding damage, Torment does a lot less damage than Bleeding when the target is moving, or sorry, when the target is not moving, but when the target is moving, then it's going to actually do a lot more damage than Bleeding. So something to keep in mind. Warriors actually do have a tiny bit of Torment available to them in the form of Impale, which is Sword 4, almost never used, but we do actually have it. You can see that it's 130 damage or 192 damage if they are moving, and the reason it says like really high numbers is that this is a single stack of Bleeding and this is 5 stacks of Torment, so that's why. So you can see that, like, okay, 5 stacks of Bleeding, let's actually just calculate this. 5 stacks of Bleeding in this case would be about 130 damage, and then it's actually, oh, well, I don't think it's supposed to be like this at level 80. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe it scales differently with levels. But that's 130 damage right there. And then the Torment is 130 damage if they're not moving, but it's 192 damage if they are moving. So that's Torment. The last damaging condition is Poison. And Warriors actually have no access to Poison. The only reason that I can actually show you Poison on my Warrior is that it's a human, and one of the human racial skills has access to Poison, okay? Poison actually deals a little bit more damage to health than Bleeding, but the only reason for that is that it scales more with your level. So it scales the same amount. It scales 6% of your condition damage, and that is how much damage it does over time, except that it's added on based on your level. So in the end, Poison is going to do more damage than Bleeding is. And it also stacks intensity. By the way, all of these things, all the damaging conditions stack intensity, by the way. None of them stack duration. It used to be the case that Burning did a lot more damage, but it stacked duration instead of intensity. Now it does a little bit less damage, and it stacks intensity as well. So, but the thing about poison is you could see this on this Reaper of Grenth skill. It says poison 30 seconds, it does 17 damage, and it is minus 33% heal effectiveness, which is kind of crazy. So, basically, if you've got poison and you use a skill to the limit, instead of doing 175 healing, it's going to heal you for like 120 or a little less. That's something really, really cool to keep in mind, because unless your enemy has something that's going to cleanse the poison away from them, they're going to be experiencing much less healing. And that's the idea behind poison, is that you want to decrease their healing effectiveness. There are certain classes that have a lot more access to poison, such as Necromancers, the new Soul Beast. Soul Beast is a Ranger Elite specialization, and they get a dagger, a main hand dagger, and their auto attack actually inflicts poison. So, something cool to keep in mind if you want to play with poison. Next, we have the crowd control conditions, and these are not going to deal any damage. I don't think any of these deal any damage at all. But they do have some other kind of interesting effect, and I think Warrior has access to most of these, so I will be able to show you most of them, except for Chill. Okay, but anyway, the first one we're going to talk about is Blind, and Warriors do have access to this in the form of Smoldering Arrow, which is Longbow 4. I don't think Rifle has any access. Yeah, Rifle doesn't have any access to it. None of their other weapons have any access to Blind. It's only Longbow 4, and it inflicts blindness for 5 seconds. This stacks duration, and it just makes it so that the next outgoing attack misses. So if they've got some powerful attack coming up, and you can see it, and you can time your blindness perfectly, then you can actually make it so it just does nothing, because they just miss. Okay? It does not stack intensity, so it's not like it's just they're going to miss a whole bunch of their next attacks. You have to keep actually applying blindness. And I think Thieves have a lot of ability to apply blindness, because they got things that like pulse blindness, I believe. And then there are also certain things that remove blindness, such as Sight Beyond Sight just removes blindness. I kind of think it should make you immune to blindness, but it just removes it, so there's that. Next condition is Chilled, and this is kind of an interesting condition because it does two different things actually, and it doesn't. I thought it dealt damage over time, but I was actually wrong about that. It doesn't do any damage over time. What it does is Chilled. I believe Reaper of Grenth. Yeah, Reaper of Grenth has access to Chilled, and that's the only reason I have this, because Warriors do not have any skills that inflict Chilled. But it reduces, it increases the cooldowns of the enemy's skills by 66%, and it also reduces their movement speed by 66%. So they're moving really slowly, and they can use their skills fast, but then the cooldown is a long time. Okay, so that's something to kind of help slow the enemy down. They can't really run away, right? They can't use all their skills in quick succession. It kind of screws up the rotations, especially if you're fighting another player. Next condition is Crippled, and this is actually inherently worse than Chilled, because all it does, and Warriors do have access to Crippled. I don't know if it's through here. I think the main way to... Oh, you can do this. It's Sundering Leap. That's a Berserker skill. And... but I'm also going to take a look at this... Oh, no, Crippled... Oh, you cannot inflict Crippled with Longbow. I thought you could. Perhaps you could do it with Rifle. Yes. Aimed Shot. Okay, so we have access to this. And it's minus 50% movement speed, and that's all it is. So it's inherently worse than Chilled. It's something that's a little bit easier to apply, but it's not going to increase their cooldowns as well. So... if you want to slow the enemy down and make it harder for them to run away, then inflict some Cripple. And Rifle Warrior can inflict Cripple, whereas I thought Longbow could, but apparently it cannot. So, and there are certain things that cure Cripple, like Warrior Warhorn 4 will remove Crippled and Immobilized and Chill, which brings me to the next condition, which is Immobilized, and... again, it stacks duration just like Crippled. Okay, it wouldn't even make sense if that like stacked intensity or anything. But immobilized is another one that stacks duration, and it just makes it so you're unable to move. And so Warrior does have access to some immobilization with Rifle. Rifle 4 inflicts immobilization for 1.5 seconds, and Longbow 5 inflicts it for 3 seconds. You can see that the durations are very short. They don't really want you to be able to permanently immobilize a target. It's definitely something that can come in handy, but you don't want to be able to permanently immobilize them, because that would be too overpowered. And then in addition, Spellbreaker can also do no escape, which means when you daze or stun an enemy, then you immobilize them for a second as well. And I think there's another trait that warriors have access to. I think it is Leg Specialist. Yeah. So whenever you cripple them, it also inflicts 1 second of immobilization. So you cripple them with Rifle 2, and Rifle 2 cripple lasts 5 seconds, but for the first second, they actually can't move at all. So keep that in mind. That's definitely something that you can keep in mind when you're making your build. Next condition I want to talk about is Fear. And there is one class that has a lot more access to Fear than the rest of us, and that is Necromancer. But Warrior does have a tiny bit of access to Fear. Basically, when you have Fear, all your skills get put on cooldown for the duration of the Fear, and you involuntarily run away from your opponent, from your enemy. And so it's definitely a good crowd control skill, but it's hard to apply for anybody other than Necromancer. For Warrior, the only skill that we have that actually affects this is a skill called Fear Me, which inflicts it for a maximum of 3 seconds if they are really close to you, and it's in a 60-second cooldown, so it does take a long time. It's very difficult to actually keep that up. That's only if they're really close to you. You can only maintain a 5% uptime. You can maintain a 5% uptime of Fear, which is not a lot. So you involuntarily retreat, and you can't act at all. And it, of course, it stacks duration like the other ones. Next one is Slow, and I think Slow is a new one. I'm not sure, but I feel like it's new. And Warriors did not have access to Slow for a long time, but with Spellbreaker, we actually did get some access to Slow, and that is through two things involved purely for Spellbreaker, and that is Dagger 2, which inflicts it for 1.5 seconds, and also if we take the trait Slow Counter, it inflicts it for 3 seconds in addition to Cripple. Slow is simply just making skills and actions slower. So if you so Blade Storm, for example, Blade Storm activates in 1.5 seconds. That's how long it takes to complete that skill. Instead, if you have Slow, then it would instead take, I believe, it's just double. I believe it would just take 3 seconds to complete the Blade Storm. So it's going to significantly reduce your DPS if you're inflicted with Slow. So something to keep in mind. You definitely do not want to have Slow on you. It's going to screw up your rotation, and it's probably going to make you die unless you can swiftly cleanse it. Next condition is Taunt, and Taunt is sort of like the opposite of Fear. Fear makes you involuntarily retreat. Well, Taunt makes you involuntarily attack your whoever inflicted taunt on you, which makes this a good condition to apply if you are playing some kind of tank build, because it will force somebody to attack you. And it also doesn't just force any kind of attack. It doesn't force you to target. It forces you to auto attack. So if you can actually see that somebody is about to launch this enormous attack on you, then you could just really quick pop a taunt on them, and then it will change it to an auto attack, and then it'll I think it puts the other skill on cooldown. Maybe it's just a reduced cooldown or something like that. But it can be used to protect you as well. So and if you're trying to protect your allies as well, you can taunt. Warriors have very limited access to taunt. I'm pretty sure that most classes have very limited access to taunt, but I know that Warriors only get a 1.5 second taunt with imminent threat on Spellbreaker, and then on Berserker they get a 1.5 second taunt and a half second taunt when you activate Berserk mode. I don't know why there's a half second there and a 1.5 second, but either way, it very short taunt durations, and you have very little access to taunts. So you definitely want to use them very sparingly if you're going to incorporate them into your build. And the last crowd control condition is weakness, and warriors do have a lot of access to weakness, and that is in the form of Hammer 2, which is Fierce Blow, and I don't think Sword has any, and I think mainly the other one that can do it is Mace, the third Mace auto attack. It doesn't say this, I think it's called Pulverize or something. The third Mace auto attack will inflict weakness. I don't think anything else inflicts weakness except for a warrior trait Body Blow, which is in strength, which inflicts it for 3 seconds whenever you do some kind of crowd control skill on them, some hard CC. CC stands for crowd control, if you guys didn't know. And basically what it means is that your endurance regenerates at 50% of that rate. So when you dodge, it's going to recharge half as fast. Okay, and then also 50% fumble, and I don't know why it says fumble, because this is the only place on the actual tooltip for the condition, that's the only place that you will ever see the word fumble in this entire game. And it's not really that well explained, but what that means is that 50% of your hits when you have weakness are glancing blows, which means they cannot be critical hits, and they do half damage, I believe. So it's going to severely reduce the amount of damage that you're taking if you can inflict weakness on the enemy, and that is why I call weakness an offensive defense, because if you inflict that, then technically you're not defending yourself, but you're reducing the amount of damage that you take, and so that makes it really important for defensive builds. When I use my Dolyak Spellbreaker, weakness is a pretty important aspect of that, how I can inflict weakness with my mace. So and then also Warhorn 5, Call to Arms on Warrior, that will actually remove weakness. I don't think any of the other skills actually inflict weakness. I could be wrong. Wild Blow removes weakness. I think that's really the main thing. And okay, so then the last condition of all, it doesn't really fit in with either of the other categories. It's not crowd control, and it's not something that deals damage over time, but it's vulnerability. And vulnerability, it stacks up to 25 times it stacks intensity, so there is a limit of how many times it can stack. But each stack is plus 1% incoming damage. Damage and condition damage. Okay, so now I know. So warriors have a lot of access to vulnerability, and that is through, not hammer, and actually not longbow either, but axe has up to 6 stacks of vulnerability from Cyclone Axe, and then Blade Storm on Dagger 5 can inflict 14 stacks of vulnerability, as well as the Greatsword auto attack inflicts vulnerability, and 2 of the mace skills actually inflict 10 stacks of vulnerability, so there's a lot of vulnerability in mace. And then also Aimed Shot, which is Rifle 2, inflicts 10 stacks, and then Brutal Shot, which is Rifle 4, inflicts 8 stacks. So there is a lot of vulnerability going around with Warrior. I can't speak for these. Do these inflict... Oh, and also Harpoon Gun number 2. Brutal Shot also inflicts 5 stacks of vulnerability. Okay, so there's that. So that's a good condition to be able to inflict. Many times what I will do, because they're going to be taking more damage when they get inflicted with vulnerability. So what I do many times for my Spellbreaker rotation is I will go up to them with my daggers, and I will first do Blade Storm, which does 14 stacks of vulnerability, and then I will do the Disrupting Stab to stun them, and then Wastrel's Ruin, which does a crap ton of damage, and they have also 14% extra incoming damage because of the vulnerability that they have. So that's an example of a way that you can incorporate that into your build. Next, we are going to talk about boons. And boons are the opposite of conditions, okay? Boons are the counterpart. And it's not the exact opposite, because it's not like, oh, well, bleeding is just damage over time, and then you've got some other, like, blood transfusion boon that's just going to do the exact opposite. It doesn't work like that. They have very different effects. But there are some counterparts that we can look at and say, okay, basically, yeah, these are opposites. Alright, but they're not exactly the same. So let's take a look at them. The first one I want to talk about is Aegis. A lot of people say Aegis. It's wrong. The condition is the boon is called Aegis. And I don't think that warriors actually have any access to Aegis. Aegis is primarily something that Guardian can apply, and what it basically does is it just stacks duration. Some of these things, by the way, some of these things stack intensity, and I'll tell you specifically when they stack intensity. But Aegis is sort of like the opposite of blindness, but it's more defensive. Blindness is offensive, where it makes the next attack miss. Aegis is the defensive, where it makes you block the next attack against you. So you've got two options. If you want to protect your ally that's at low health, you can either blind the enemy that's attacking him, or you can grant him Aegis, which will make him block the attack. And after you block the attack, it removes the Aegis. Just like after you miss with an attack, it removes blindness. Okay? The next boon is actually a very new boon, and it is called Alacrity. Alacrity used to be, way back a long time ago, it used to be something that only Chronomancers could do, but then they started giving it to Revenant a little bit, and now a few classes can apply Alacrity because they've nerfed the effect. In the very beginning, it reduced your skill recharges by 66%. That was way too much, and they quickly nerfed that to 33%. Now it's considered a boon, not a unique buff like the Banner of Discipline is, or any of the warrior banners. It's not a unique thing anymore that you can't remove. It's now a boon, and it's been nerfed to 25%. So you can generally apply it for longer, and it's easier to have 100% uptime of Alacrity now. It's just that it's not as high or as huge of an effect to have 100% Alacrity. So warriors have no access to Alacrity, which is pretty predictable. It's mainly kind of a mage thing, and so obviously we wouldn't have that. But that's, just keep in mind that it's now a boon, so if you're a Spellbreaker, you can easily remove Alacrity. So something definitely good to keep in mind. Next boon is called Fury, and Fury is really cool because it is just a flat 20% extra chance to critical hit. Pretty good, because it basically means that if you have a reliable source of Fury, perhaps in raids or other kinds of team-based environments, perhaps if you're a warrior and you have axes, and you can apply a lot of Fury to yourself, because if you have Axe Mastery, then you got almost 100% uptime of Fury if you continuously use Cyclone Axe. So if you've got a constant source of Fury, you actually don't have to bring your critical chance up higher than 80%, because it's just a flat bonus. So if you've got 80% chance to crit, and then you get Fury, it's going to be literally 100% chance, and every single one of your hits will be a crit. So obviously that stacks duration, but it does not get removed when you critical hit. So I mean, keep in mind, you're under those effects for whatever the duration. Next one is called Might, and it's basically the opposite of Vulnerability. Whereas Vulnerability is an extra incoming 1% damage and condition damage. Might, every stack of Might gives you 30 power and 30 condition damage, and it stacks up to 25 times, just like Vulnerability does. Now it's giving you an actual bonus in stats rather than saying you just have this amount increased damage, because it's going to affect different classes differently if it's just a percentage. However, warriors are able to actually get extra benefit out of Might. This is fairly new. Through this trait, Pinnacle of Strength, instead of getting 30 power from Might, they will get 40 power from Might. So at 25 stacks of Might, whereas anyone other than a warrior would get 750 extra power, the warrior gets 1,000 extra power, and the warrior is going to be that much more powerful. Okay? So that is Might. And it just stacks duration, and of course it does not get removed unless somebody actually forcefully removes it. Next one is Protection. Okay, and Protection is a pretty good boon to have, and warriors do have access to Protection. Also, we do have access to Might, by the way, in the form of many things, but one of them being Magebane Tether will give you 24 stacks of Might, which is insane. Also, what was that noise? That was weird. That was really loud. Oh, that's probably some kind of Palawa Joko event or something. I don't know. But anyway, so warriors do have access to protection, and I can't remember if they have access to protection in any of these, but I know that they have access to protection. Yeah, there's another Spellbreaker. That's the noise, probably. They do have access to protection as Spellbreakers with guard counter. What this means is that when you perform a full counter, then you get 3 seconds of protection. You could probably read the tooltip right now that it's minus 33% incoming damage. Now, this does not, keep this in mind, this does not reduce the damage from conditions. Only direct power damage. So if you're fighting somebody that's applying crap loads of conditions to you, then protection is not going to help you at all. Okay? However, if you're fighting somebody, like if you're fighting a Spellbreaker and you got conditions, then, sorry, if you have protection, then the Spellbreaker is not going to be able to do as much against you, because it's going to actually help you out a lot. And of course it stacks duration, not intensity. That would be crazy if you could get 3 stacks of protection and just remove all incoming damage, but that's not the way it stacks. Next next boon is Quickness. Warriors do have access to Quickness, so I can actually show you. On Axe 4, actually we have a few stacks of we have a few sources of Quickness. We have Axe 4, and then we also have in Discipline, we have Heightened Focus, which applies Quickness. We have Sun and Moon Style, which applies Quickness. And we even have Frenzy, which applies 6 seconds of Quickness. Quickness is basically the opposite of slow. Instead of activating your skills twice as much time, instead Quickness makes you activate your skills twice as fast. So instead of activating this Blade Storm in 1.5 seconds, it would instead take 3/4 of a second. Okay, or instead of taking, let's take something like, okay, Natural Healing takes 1 1/4 seconds to activate. If you have Quickness, then you can instead activate it in a little over half of a second. Something very, very good to have. It's a very, very good boon. Next one is Regeneration, and a lot of classes have access to some amount of Regeneration, but other classes can make better use of it than others. Warriors do have the potential to have 100% regeneration uptime, and that is through the Inspiring Battle Standard trait. When they have Inspiring Battle Standard, all of their banners, every 3 seconds they apply 3 seconds of regeneration, so it pulses. Basically, you can have the regeneration removed, but it is going to pulse back on them. So, and that's really good because it basically protects against someone constantly removing it. The problem is, the regeneration is not that great unless you have extra healing power to make it more potent. Okay, and I actually do have a build that focuses a lot on healing power. But as you can see, with no extra healing power, now this is scaled down heavily, but as you can see, with no healing power, it only heals 1154 health, and that's only a little bit higher than my maximum health. So that's over the course of 90 seconds. Okay, 90 seconds. That's not very much. If you have more healing power, then of course it's going to give you more health. And of course it also scales with boon duration. So if you have a lot of regeneration and you want to incorporate that into a support build, then definitely you want something like Harrier's Gear that's going to give you power, but then healing power to make every tick heal you more, and also concentration, which makes the regeneration last longer and heal you for more ticks. Next one is Regeneration, and warriors, not Regeneration, the next one is Resistance, and warriors actually have a lot of access to Resistance. Resistance is a special boon which makes you, for the duration of the boon, it makes you completely immune to conditions. Immune. That means if you have immobilization, you can still walk. If you've got any kind of damage dealing condition on you, confusion, torment, bleeding, burning, poison, you can do whatever you want. You're not going to take any damage. If you've got fear on you, you can still run around. You do not retreat. If you've got vulnerability, you do not take that extra damage. Warriors have several sources of resistance. They've got 5 seconds with Featherfoot Grace. They've got some of this with Berserker's Stance, They've got Healing Signet, which applies 6 seconds of resistance. They used to actually have more access to resistance, but Berserker Stance got kind of nerfed. It used to be 7 seconds and on a 60-second cooldown, I believe, but they changed it to a 30-second cooldown and only 4 seconds. So you can't maintain 100% resistance uptime, which is good. You should not be able to, but you know, the point is conditions are completely ineffective on you for the duration of that boon. That's probably, I would say, the most useful boon in the entire game is resistance. So keep that in mind. In my World v World build, what I do is I have Berserker Stance, which gives me resistance, and then Balance Stance, which gives me stability. We're going to talk about stability in a second, and then Endure Pain, which makes me completely invulnerable, and all these last for 4 seconds. So basically for 4 seconds, nothing can touch me. And that's really useful. It takes up all 3 of your utility slots, but you're basically getting 4 seconds out of every fight that you are completely invincible. So, something to keep in mind. Next boon is Retaliation, and warriors do get a little bit of retaliation access. One is through the defense line, which I will show you right now. It makes it so that when you block an attack, or if you're struck by a critical hit, you gain 5 seconds of retaliation. And also Retaliation gives you bonus toughness. That's not really relevant here. And then also, I know that Spellbreakers have Imminent Threat, which gives you 5 seconds of retaliation. I don't think Berserkers have anything. Yeah. And so it's basically those 2 sources of retaliation. What that means is that a percentage of incoming damage is reflected back at the other person. This is not really a defensive boon. It's more of an offensive boon, because when it gets reflected back at the source, it's not taking the damage away from the damage that you receive. It's just simply dealing extra damage to that person, to that enemy, based on how much damage they did to you. So it's a useful boon, but keep in mind that it's not defensive. It's just going to deal extra damage to them. Okay. Next one is Stability, and stability is very useful. You can see warriors do have a lot of sources of stability. We've got a Shattering Blow. We've got Balance Stance, which is... where is Balance Stance? Here. We've got Balance Stance right there. We've got Dolyak Signet right here. We've got Stomp. Even Stomp applies stability. Even our elite skill Rampage applies stability. Okay, and then we even got some traits like Brave Stride, which applies stability when you first enter combat. This boon means that you cannot be controlled. You can run around and they can hit you all you want, but instead of knocking you down, like for example, if you're fighting another warrior and they use let's say Backbreaker. Okay, Backbreaker is Hammer 5 and it's a 2-second knockdown. They use Backbreaker, and instead of knocking you down for 2 seconds, it just simply removes the stability. Okay? And if you have something like Balance Stance, then you're getting 2 stacks of stability. It stacks intensity, by the way, which means that it's instead of getting 1 stack of stability for 2 seconds, because it says 2 stacks of stability, instead you're getting actual 2 stacks of stability for 1 second. So they remove 1 stack, you still have 1 stack on Balance Stance. Or Dolyak Signet gives you 10 stacks of stability for 8 seconds. So they have to knock you down, or fear you, or pull you, or whatever, any kind of those crowd control effects. They have to do that 11 times in 8 seconds before any of them have an effect on you. They're not going to do that, and that is why Dolyak Signet is pretty much just become completely stable for 8 seconds. Now once it wears off, of course, then they can do whatever you want, or whatever they want, but for that 8 seconds you cannot be phased, you cannot be knocked down or anything. 2 more boons to discuss. First one is Swiftness, and Swiftness is very simple. It's basically the opposite of Cripple, with a slightly different percentage. Okay, so Cripple reduces your movement speed by 50%. Okay, Swiftness you can see Swiftness here. Swiftness increases your movement speed by 33%. It's not 50%. The 50% buff is actually a unique buff. It's not a boon, so it cannot be removed if you actually have it. 50% is actually super speed, which warriors recently got access to with Spellbreaker. Super speed is the insanely fast movement speed buff, and it cannot be removed. But swiftness can be removed, and it's easier to apply. Everybody has access to swiftness, and it's something that is going to make you move faster. Then the last one is Vigor, and Vigor is accessible a little bit by warriors in the defense. In the defense trait, basically, it makes all of your stances also apply 6 Vigor to yourself. Vigor is kind of the opposite of weakness. However, it doesn't increase your damage. It's just, if you have Vigor and weakness, then your endurance is going to regenerate at the normal rate, as far as I remember. I could be doing the math wrong, but weakness is 50% slower endurance regeneration, and Vigor is 50% faster endurance regeneration. So you do that, and you've got 6 seconds of Vigor with every single stance, which means if you got all 3 stances, then you're going to be applying 18 seconds of Vigor to yourself. And then you've also got Warhorn 5, which is 10 seconds of Vigor. And so you've got a whole 28 seconds of Vigor if you can apply it correctly, if you've got all your stances and everything. It's very bursty. You're not going to be able to maintain 100% Vigor uptime as a warrior, perhaps maybe with other classes, and keep in mind that these are also affecting allies on the Warhorn, so no, it would be way too overpowered if you had all that access to Vigor. But that's what it is. It's the endurance regeneration. So that being said, those are all of the conditions and boons. If you need to refer back to this video, if you want to go and reference this video, hopefully it is helpful to you, and hopefully you can end up getting a lot of use out of this, and just remember those. You might have to study them a little bit, but usually they're pretty straightforward. Aegis is a shield, so obviously it blocks an attack. Cripple is what's the thing? It's a foot with like a lightning bolt through it. So obviously it's going to reduce your movement speed and everything. Chilled is the snowflake. A lot of these things are pretty straightforward, but I did want to actually talk about those conditions and boons, because they're very, very useful to keep in mind, especially if you're doing a condition build, and especially if you're doing some kind of support build. You definitely want to be familiar, because down over here, I'm pointing at, as if you could see me, as if you can see where I'm pointing. Down here is where all those boons and conditions are going to show up, and you need to be familiar with those. Okay, and before level 80, it's not super important, but eventually when you get to level 80, you're going to definitely need to keep in mind what you're applying to yourself, what you're applying to allies, and what enemies are applying to you, and what you're applying to enemies. So, that being said, I really hope this video was helpful. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, and of course subscribe. Big thanks to Sem, which is my first patron. If you want to become a patron, then link to my Patreon down in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.